Hello and welcome to our How to Choose the Right University for Your Globally Mobile Teen webinar today. This is part of our International Education and Schools Fair online. So how do you make that choice? Selecting the best tertiary education can be a challenge, and there's much more than just the course and the reputation of the university to consider when you're drawing up a shortlist. Journalist Marianne Curphey from Relocate Global and a national journalist talks to Fiona McKenzie, head of Carfax Education, to discuss how to plan for the significant events in your teen's life, what to look for and how to apply. And in the context of global mobility, I'll also add my insights. So why is it important for corporate employers and the relocation professionals supporting international assignments to understand the priorities of parents with older children, particularly today in the fast changing world and with ever increasing costs? So let's hand over to our panelists today, Fiona McKenzie, Head of Education, Carfax Education, and Marianne Curphey.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for that introduction. And Fiona, I know that this time of year, everybody in the UK is rushing to get their UCAS form in. But actually, if you're an international family and you're thinking about university, the planning process needs to start much, much earlier than a couple of months in the summer before September.
Yes, Marianne, I completely agree. I mean, ideally, certainly if you're approaching the UK, you would really want to be sort of starting to think about it 3 years in advance. And that's partly because you want to make sure you're making the right choices of subjects in your kind of A-levels or IB, so that you're not kind of closing any avenues down. And if you're thinking about the US, then probably you really need to be thinking about it about 4 years in advance in terms of just building your profile towards making a competitive application. So yeah, the planning does need to start early. It's that research, the planning, visiting, building your profile, all takes time.
And in terms of choosing a university, I mean, that's also the variety of choice that an international family could have potentially, but also perhaps being overwhelmed by that choice. So how might a globally mobile student think about which country to choose in and which universities to select?
It's a really complicated one, and it certainly, obviously, it slightly depends on which part of the world you're living in, because there may well be very good universities there, and actually there may be no need for you to kind of move to another country. I think a lot of it could be driven by the subject choice, and I think one of the advantages that internationally mobile families have is this kind of open-mindedness to studying in lots of different jurisdictions. For example, I've got a student who wants to study marine biology, so she's applied to St Andrews, but she's also exploring opportunities in Australia and in Florida and America, because if that's what you want to do, why wouldn't you go to one of the best universities in the world to do it? You wouldn't just restrict yourself necessarily to one country. So I think that's a big advantage of being an internationally mobile family, is you have that breadth of understanding and that open-mindedness.
So that sounds amazing, but the timeline for those universities and those countries is going to be different. So, for example, in the UK, the focus is now on getting the UCAS application in before the 25th of January next year, and students are visiting universities now and have been sort of in May and June time previously. What about the timeline for the Middle East and Asia and the US? Are they all different, or are they all focused towards the end of the year?
They all kind of vary, but ultimately, obviously, they all kind of coalesce around this time of year. I think partly because it's a little bit unfair to expect students to have a clear idea of what they want to do any younger. I mean, already some people would argue that having to make a choice at the sort of age 16 or 17 on what you want to study for the next kind of 3 to 4 years is already quite early. I think with Europe, you have slightly longer. With the European deadlines, they tend to be sort of spring of next year. The UK one, absolutely, as you point out, is the 25th of January. The US ones, it depends which application system you're going through, whether you're doing early action, early decision, or regular, and they all have slightly different deadlines. So I think for an internationally mobile family, this needs to be a key part of your research, is understanding the application processes for the different countries and when the deadlines are, because they do all vary, and you need to be quite on this, because you don't want to miss opportunities. And I think, you know, for example, Oxford and Cambridge, or if you want to do medicine or dentistry or veterinary in the UK, that deadline is actually the 15th of October in the year preceding. And if you want to go to, if you're kind of creative and you're looking at the conservatoire route, then that's an even earlier deadline. So it really is behoving on people to be really on this and to really do their research. And that kind of goes back to why I think it's so important to start early, because then you're aware. And we spend a lot of time building timelines and action plans for families, so that nobody can drop the ball or miss the boat.
So that's really useful. So when you're thinking about applying via the UCAS system in the UK, the advice from teachers is to think about your personal statement in terms of 80-20. So you'll concentrate very much on why you're choosing the course, your own academic record, your intellectual curiosity, experiences to do with the course and the subject that you want to study. And only 20% you're advised to spend on your extracurricular activities, your interests, things that demonstrate that you're a rounded person. But it's different in other parts of the world, isn't it? And the application form and the sort of personal statements are very different. Can you sort of give us a flavour of what's needed in other jurisdictions?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the kind of the starkest contrast in a way is America, because the kind of personal statement or the personal essay for America is driven by a series of different prompt questions. And quite often that's focused around an event that maybe has changed your life, or something that's affected a change in you or had an impact on you. And that's much more about you as a person and your personal experiences and a sort of personal growth journey. And what they're really looking for there is how you write, how you communicate, and they're trying to see what sort of person you are and what sort of fit you would be for their university. Whereas the UK is very much more focused on the academics, and as you say, about 80% of any personal statement should be focused on why you're passionate about this subject. What is it that's motivated you to do it? What have you done over and above the curriculum to show that you've kind of gone the extra mile, and you've really sort of explored this. So it is very different. Some European universities don't require a personal statement at all. So it really, again, varies around the world, and you need to have a clear understanding of what each system requires you to do, so that you can make sure that you're kind of targeting the right things at the right time.
You find that employers are aware of this, Fiona, when they might have to allow 3 to 4 years, or is this generally not known? Because this is quite a serious problem if young people are in the wrong country.
Yes, I'm not sure that they are, Fiona, actually. I think that's a really interesting point, because I think obviously employers are very focused on sort of schools, and they understand that bit, and that's quite often a part of somebody's kind of package. But I think by the time the children get to sort of 18, the companies, in my experience, tend to sort of feel that they're not so much their responsibility anymore. But I do think parents need to be aware of this. And one of the things that it will impact on, particularly for somewhere like the UK, is fee status. Because if you are living internationally, or you have been for a significant amount of time, it can sometimes be hard to demonstrate that you are ordinarily resident, which is the technical term, in the UK. And the gap between international fees and domestic fees is quite extreme. And domestic fees are capped at £9,250. But international fees can vary, you know, up to £45,000, £50,000, depending on the course that you're doing. So I think it is probably something that parents need to highlight with employers, because it needs to be part of that kind of planning.
I mean, Fiona Murchie, have you found now that with the end of the pandemic that families are starting to be more mobile, and assignments are up and available, and this is starting to influence the way that families think about their future plans?
Yes, that's what we've been picking up, and all towards the end of the pandemic, and in fact all the way through it, that people's perspectives have changed about where they want to be in the world, and also the employers picking up on if wanting to keep their talent, which very often is highly skilled, and there are huge skills shortages, then there's a lot more potentially that can be done to support those families to be where they want to be. So we're seeing that families could be based in one country in Asia, but would have to cover wider areas, and they've chosen a particular country because the school is the right school for them in that area and the lifestyle suits them. And that also has been replicated in Europe as well. And this has also meant that boarding schools for international students in a particular country, so children can board in that country, and the parents, maybe dual career couples as well, would move around the region and had therefore selected a boarding school rather than a day school. So that's an interesting trend. But I think we trying to highlight that it's really worth supporting families all the way through education, particularly as there are such severe shortages, because I do think families will just leave and say, as you pointed out, Fiona, right, we've got 4 years to make this decision. I'd like to repatriate. If you won't allow me to repatriate, then I'm afraid I'm moving on to the next organisation.
And actually, Fiona, you touched on the fees. I mean, that's a really important point, not just in terms of what student debt might accumulate during the course, but actually in terms of value versus prestige. So how can parents find that balance between a university education that's going to prepare them for a great career and makes them very employable, that has a high status globally, versus the cost of going to a top university compared to perhaps going to a slightly cheaper alternative or in a different country?
I think there's lots to sort of unpack there in a sense. I think a lot of people are driven by the kind of rankings, because they sort of see let's say the Times Higher Education rankings have come out recently, the sort of top 100, and a lot of families will kind of go to that and say, right, we need to pick a university from here because they're well known, they've got good leverage in the kind of global employment market, and people have heard of them. But I would also say that if you know the sort of course you want to do, there are also other universities that won't be so well known but will be very well known for a particular course. So for example, if you wanted to do kind of games design, for example, you wouldn't be going to Oxford, Cambridge or UCL to do that. You would be looking at a completely different set. You'd be looking at Bournemouth, or you'd be looking at Brighton, or you'd be looking at York. So I think that's why, again, this planning comes into play. If you need to have a sort of sense of the direction that you want to go in, and is it better to kind of pick the course and to find the right university that offers a really prestigious course that's well recognized in that employment field? Or if you're not quite sure what you want to do, is it better to just do a sort of more general degree at a kind of prestigious university, and then you'll kind of get the recognition? But I think that, certainly talking to employers, and Fiona, I don't know whether you find this too, that they're looking for people who have got a good degree from a good university, because it's actually more about the transferable skills in this day and age than necessarily the subject knowledge. And I think that's what employers are looking for. They can teach you how to use an Excel spreadsheet, but they need to know that you've got the intellectual agility, you've got the kind of ability to critically analyze information, those sorts of things, which should be inherent in any good degree.
And also the human skills, this emotional intelligence, which is so difficult to define, but that's the sort of thing that comes up, is that whether you're a pure scientist or a pure mathematician or going into pharmaceuticals, you need to be able to communicate well and manage people well. And in this complex international world, that means you're managing across different cultures as well. And there's also huge amounts of cost involved. So it's this magic thing of how to create a well-rounded person who's also resilient and creative.
I think with the shift towards paying for fees and the increase in fees, universities recognise all around the world that they're going to have to provide value for their students, and the value is in their critical thinking skills and the intellectual agility, but it's also in employability later. So certainly I've found when visiting universities and looking around them that there is a big emphasis on where students go after they've graduated, what kind of careers they can hope to move into, what they've learnt in their degree that they can then use as part of their work. And many of the best universities also have very well-established career departments where the students can get career advice, add-on courses if they want to learn an extra language or an extra skill, and that parents can when they visit the universities or when they look at the sort of interactive webinars online, they can see just what emphasis the university is putting on employability post-graduation.
I think just to add to that, Marianne, because I think it is a really good point, and I think certainly students more and more judge the value they've gained from university by the employment opportunities that it gives them. But I think also universities got much smarter about things like years in industry as part of their degree. So actually, you can graduate with, let's say, an engineering degree with a kind of professional accreditation and a year of actually work experience, which is hugely helpful because it means you started to put the theoretical knowledge into practice, but you've also started to build a network within that industry, which will make it easier for you when you come to kind of look for jobs at the end. So I think, yeah, there's a really good university, Robert Gordon, which has one of the highest employability stats of any university, certainly in the UK. And every single degree there is designed with professionals. It has embedded professional qualifications. Everybody does a year of work experience. And not surprisingly, something like 98% of them are employed within sort of 6 months of leaving university. So I think you're right, there's definitely a trend towards that. But it's not so prevalent maybe in the research-based universities, which is still very much focused around the kind of academics.
And in terms of choosing the right university, I mean, it's a very complicated blend of the best universities, the best courses, the accommodation, the facilities, the extracurricular opportunities. I mean, what about accommodation? Because that's a worry perhaps for parents who are sending their children to a different country in terms of the accommodation that they can expect to be provided for. Some UK universities say that they're going to provide for the full 3 years, which they don't offer to domestic students. But again, if you're not able to visit in person, how can parents negotiate finding accommodation in a country that they're not living in for their student?
I think universities, obviously the pandemic's kind of driven this quite a lot, but universities advertise their accommodation. They've got lots of information available online, but it's also you need to talk to people who are there, because some halls are really accessible and, you know, are very popular. Other halls, for whatever reason, aren't. And you don't want to find yourself, you know, in a university accommodation that's half an hour away from university with a bus that only runs twice a day. So you need to kind of really do your due diligence on that. And as you say, if you can't visit, it is tough, but there is lots of information available. And there's lots of sort of student chat lines on a lot of the university websites where you can actually just ask those sorts of questions, because it is those nitty gritty things that actually impact on your daily life as a student. You might have chosen the perfect university and a great course, but actually I would say that if your accommodation isn't a great fit and the kind of people you're sharing with aren't a natural fit, then that's going to have far more impact on kind of whether you enjoy it or not. So it is really important to do that. I think the cost of living is another factor to kind of bear in mind with this, and particularly with accommodation, you know, because we were saying earlier that, you know, cheapest accommodation in London is still more expensive than the most expensive accommodation in other parts of the UK. So you have to sort of, I think, be quite savvy about that nowadays and think, you know, what's that going to look like? It's not just the university fees. It's actually you've got to be able to afford all the rest as well, travel and books and eating and, you know, feeding yourself and that sort of thing. So, and also I think that from that kind of point of view of transitioning, you know, do you want your child to go into a self-catered place? They're going to have to cook for themselves. They may be brilliant cooks, they may be super independent, that could be great, but they could also end up living on pizza for a kind of term and a half, which isn't ideal. Or do you want them to go into a kind of catered environment where you don't have to worry about that? So there's lots of different things that I think you need to take into consideration when you're thinking about accommodation.
I think also in terms of the Asian universities, Fiona Murchie, have you found that they're really starting to change their offering and become much more attractive for countries living, for parents living in that region?
Well, I know that there's a lot of good schools and universities in Asia, and they're driven by technology and also this sense of what the future of work is going to look like. And so it may be that they'll be seeking a totally different style of university than you would if you were coming from the UK or Europe or even the US. So I think that's something to take into consideration. And also that there are numbers of people moving out of China and Hong Kong and moving possibly to Australia or to other parts of the world, and the styles of university and would be completely different. So I think it is about, and also that these young people are probably from an international family, are used to moving a lot, so they're potentially more happy to move around and don't have such a problem with the transition where they're going, and are perhaps a bit more savvy than other people may be. So, you know, you can't obviously wrap young people in cotton wool, but certainly things are going to change a lot. And then there's also the cost of the travel, but there's also the opportunities of travel. And young people nowadays are very driven by travel and what they can do when they're in an area. So I would imagine that that's quite high on the priorities if you're living in an exciting part of the world.
So Fiona, are there any sort of final points that we haven't covered that you think parents and students need to think about? I mean, we've covered early planning and thinking about where you might be domiciled, thinking about fees, thinking about status and value. We've talked about choosing the right course in the right university and preparing a statement or an essay. But is there anything else that parents need to think about now if their teen is going to go to university in a couple of years?
Well, I think it kind of goes back again to the research, really, and I think also trying to factor in being able to visit, because I think there's nothing like actually sort of being able to put the boots on the ground and walk around it to see whether this is going to be a good fit. Because at the end of the day, for me, it's about the fit. You know, if the student's in the right place, they will have a great time and they'll love it and they'll get a great degree. And it's quite hard to find that out unless you've had a look. But having said that, universities now have got fantastic resources online. And I always think that just chatting to students who are there, and I'm sure that if you reach out to your network, there will be people that you can talk to who are at these universities to kind of get a bit more of a feeling about what it's like. But yeah, plan early, try and visit. Make sure you're making kind of good subject choices so you're keeping your options open. And think about what style of learning suits you. The American system is much more academically flexible, as is the Canadian and the Australian, whereas the UK is much more subject specific, as is the kind of European system. So I think it's really important to work out what you want to get out of the experience and which environment's going to suit you best.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona, for being with us. Lots of food for thought there. Lots of ideas for parents to be thinking about and preparing for. And it's a very exciting, perhaps for parents, a slightly daunting process, but one that young people should be encouraged to take part in as well themselves and feed their own thoughts and preferences and ideas into, so that it's a joint choice between parents and child.
Well, thank you very much to you both for this very interesting conversation. I'm sure it's going to evolve over the years. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So we've been talking today to Fiona McKenzie, Head of Education at Carfax Education, and also Marianne Curphey, who is a financial and technology journalist and works with Relocate Global and is the author of 2 finance books. I'm Fiona Murchie, Managing Editor of Relocate Global and Think Global People, and we've been producing this webinar as part of the International Education and Schools Fair. You can log on to our website and access a lot of material and information about international education and schools, and also keep in touch with information on global mobility. And coming up soon is our Guide to International Education and Schools 22-23 with all sorts of helpful information, which is now available online. Thank you for joining us today.